Thank you for attending today's webinar titled Amendment 4, How Will It Affect Cities? This session will last 45 minutes with 15 minutes for questions at the end. Please hold your questions for that time. Use the Q&A section on your screen to submit your questions during that time, or you may submit them to the webinar speakers via their contact information at a later time. Today's presentation will be posted on the FLC website at www.floridaleagueofcities.com under the Events and Training tab as soon as possible following the session. Today's speakers are Amber Hughes. Amber is a legislative advocate for the League, and she handles finance, taxation, and personnel issues. Also, John Thomas. John is the Director of Communications and Political Initiatives for the League.
Good afternoon. This is Amber Hughes. Did you want to say a few words at the beginning, John?
Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. I think we're going to have a very good session. And if you have any questions, as they mentioned, please do so at the end. But we're excited about Amendment 4 and the work that we have to do over the next several weeks as this campaign gears up.
All right. Well, I'm going to get started, and I'm going to start very broadly. First of all, as most of you know, there are 5 different ways to amend our Constitution. And I just wanted to give you an understanding of how we ended up where we are today. Obviously, you can amend the Constitution by a ballot initiative, by the Constitutional Commission, the Taxation Budget Reform Commission, but we ended up here today talking about Amendment 4 because of the process that allows the Florida legislature to pass a joint resolution. So in the 2011 session, they passed committee substitute for 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 House Joint Resolution 381. And my fun fact of the day is that is the most committee substitutes that any proposed constitutional amendment has ever had in the history of Florida. Just to give you a little, the House vote, which voted in May of 2011, it was a bill sponsored by Representative Dorworth, and it passed by way more than the 3/5 needed for a joint resolution. In the Senate, it passed 2 days later. They only got 1 more vote than the 3/5 that they needed, but that joint resolution was sponsored by Senator Fasano. And the basics of the constitutional amendment, and before I get started in this, I just want to say that the 2012 general election ballot is going to be very complicated. I think we're all aware of that. There are going to be 10 different constitutional amendments, and Amendment 4 alone has almost 700 words. So when you think about what the average voter is going to see on election day, it's going to be very complicated, and this amendment alone is incredibly technical. All amendments require a 60% voter approval in order to become effective, and the most part, Amendment 4 is going to be effective upon passage, except for the one provision, which we call the first-time homesteader provision. That will be effective January 1st, 2013, but will be for any property that was purchased January 1st, 2012. And we'll get into that more when we get into the specifics of the amendment. So Amendment 3. 3 primary different elements of it. The first is the Non-Homestead Assessment Cap. The second is the first-time homesteader exemption, and then the last we call the anti-recapture. And I'm going to go specifically into each one of these. Now we're going to get into the meat. So the first provision of the constitutional amendment, and probably the one that has the greatest fiscal impact, is what we call the Non-Homestead Assessment Cap. And if you recall, back when Save Our Homes was passed in 1990 and became effective in 1995, it placed a 3% assessment limitation on all homesteaded property, meaning that if your just value increased, your assessed value could only increase by 3%. There was no such limitation on any non-homesteaded property until 2008 when Amendment 1 passed and a 10% assessment limitation went into place. And when we talk about non-homesteaded properties, we pretty much mean almost every property that is not homesteaded, with the exception of agricultural land. So that means your multifamily, your condos, your commercial, your industrial, your second homes, homes that are owned from people outside the state. All of those will be impacted by this provision if it passes. I think that when you look at what happened with Save Our Homes and subsequently what happened with the creation of portability in Save Our Homes, that's kind of going to give us a little bit of a view into the potential impacts of this. Separate and apart from the financial impacts, which we're going to talk about at the very end, this is an interesting tax policy because you're creating winners and losers. When you put this type of cap, especially when the market is so depressed, you are lining up property owners to pay drastically different taxes. So if you have existing businesses and then you have new businesses or businesses that want to expand in the future, they're going to pay drastically different taxes, and it becomes a competition issue. When we are in the day and age when we want to talk about growth and wanting to get our economy back on track, it does not make sense to have such an unfair tax system, especially that will create such disparity among identical property owners that are businesses. I also think it's important to point out that when Amendment 1 passed, they put the 10% assessment cap or limitation in place that it was supposed to sunset in 2019, meaning that it would go away. This proposed constitutional amendment will extend that out to 2023, so that means that the impacts of this are going to be felt for 4 more years than they should have been. Another thing I want to point out, and this is true for almost every single one of the elements of Amendment 4, is that this does not apply to school property taxes. It only applies to non-school, meaning city, county, and special district. The idea that this is good tax policy is a hard message for the proponents of this amendment to make when they're not making it equal across the board. I think there's a lot of unintended consequences, and I think that it hasn't really been fleshed out by the proponents of this bill. The second piece that I want to talk about is the first-time homesteader exemption. And so first-time homesteader exemption, first-time homesteader is defined as someone who has not owned homesteaded property in 3 years in the state of Florida. So that means it could be someone that moves here from out of state. It could be someone that has been in foreclosure and has been renting for the last few years. So it's a little bit of a misnomer to call it first-time homesteader. It's really just someone who's taken a break from home ownership and is coming back into play. The exemption itself will be 50% of the just value of a property up to the county median. So what does that mean? That sounds a little complicated. So for example, I live in Leon County. The median home value in Leon County is $151,000. So if I go buy a house that's $300,000, and I'm a first-time homesteader, meaning I don't currently have homesteaded property and have not for 3 years, then I can get an additional exemption for $150,000. That's going to be the initial year. Every year after that, for the next 5 years, it's going to reduce by 20%. This is a pretty big teaser rate, I like to call it. And the thing that you have to understand about this, it does not exclude you from getting any other homestead exemptions that are in that section of the Constitution, such as the actual homesteader exemption when it becomes applicable, or the veterans exemption. So when you talk about a 50% exemption in the first year up to the county median, and then a 20% for the first 5 years, that's quite a big number. I think that's important to point out. This does not, once again, apply to school taxes. This is a very unfair way of trying to get property tax relief off the backs of the cities and the counties and the special districts when they only levy about 49% of property taxes. When I talked at the beginning about the effective date of this proposed constitutional amendment, this is the one piece that will actually be effective January 1st, 2013, meaning for the your next year's budget. But it will apply to any home that has been purchased by a first-time homesteader as of January 1st, 2012. So if you go buy a house right now and this passes in November, you will get the benefit of this first-time homesteader exemption. Next slide. Going faster, okay. So this is the part that probably has the most political power, I would say, when it comes to what the proponents of the bill would like. If you all recall, you probably don't, but historically, property values will never decline. Property is a great investment. That's kind of what I grew up with and what we had always heard. When Save Our Homes passed in 1992, there was a provision called the Recapture provision, or the Recapture rule, which was a rule adopted by the Department of Revenue. What that said was that As long as your just value grew, obviously your taxes could only go by 3%. That was your assessment limitation. And then you get what the difference between your just value and your assessed value is. And we call that your Save Our Homes differential. So your just value is your market value, and your assessed value is what the millage is multiplied by to get your taxes. So as we've gone along throughout the years, the Save Our Home differential has grown. Well, then when we hit the housing market boom, all of a sudden people's just value or market value began to decrease, but their assessed value continued to decrease. It recaptured some of that Save Our Home differential. That was part of the plan with Save Our Homes, but since no one had ever realized that, it caused a little bit of a stir, I would say, in the newspapers. This amendment would allow the legislature to go in and modify or remove that recapture provision, meaning that the only time your assessment limitation could go up would be if your market or just value went up. And you're like, why is this important? I think it's important if you look at the numbers from 2006 to from fiscal year 06-07 to fiscal year 2011-2012, county property taxable values have decreased by 24.2%, and cities have decreased by almost 20%, and that is with that recapture provision in law, meaning that we got the taxing entities were able to recoup or recapture some of that Save Our Home differential. If we had not had this provision in place, I would hate to see what the numbers would look like. And we all know that the cities and the counties have had to dig into their budgets and really, cut that, and have had to deal with a drastic reduction in revenue, and that is with this provision in place. But property taxes are one of our largest pieces of our general fund revenue. It's 60% for the counties and 42% for the cities. It's important that we have the ability to have stability through this revenue source as we go on. With that, we're going to get to some of the numbers. Once again, one thing I do want to mention is when I show you the numbers, this actually is the only piece or element of this proposal that will include some school impact. The Save Our Homes or Homestead anti-recapture will actually has a school impact, but that's not reflected in the numbers you're about to see. So the first slide, and this is the taxable value. So this means what your millage is multiplied by in order to get the taxes or the revenues that the cities and counties receive. Obviously, we have fiscal year, and then I've broken it out into the different components of the constitutional amendment. The first one is first-time homesteaders. Second one is the reduction in the non-homestead assessment cap from 10% to 5%. And then I've broken out recapture into homestead recapture and non-homestead anti-recapture. And then the total at the very end is the reduction of taxable value in each fiscal year because if this constitutional amendment were proposed. Next slide. And this is what you really want to see. This is the big slide, the one you want to print out and make sure everyone sees. And this is actually the estimated tax impact. So what this does is it assumes a millage of a statewide millage of 10.9, and that's for all taxing entities that are non-schools. So if you live in an area where you have higher millage than probably the statewide average, then you're going to be disproportionately impacted by this. And just to give you a highlight, so if you look at the first year in 2013, 2014, the impacts are not that bad. I used that slightly, 187.2 million. But if you get all the way down to 2016, 2017, you'll see that they're up to 693.2 million. So we're looking at a total 4-year potential impact for cities, counties, and special districts of almost $1.7 billion. And the thing that I want to point out here, when the Revenue Estimating Conference looks at impacts of legislation or joint resolutions, they usually only go 5 years out. And the thing about this proposal, since we are in such a depressed housing market, is that you don't see the impact as we reach normal growth rates. In 2016, 2017, we are not anticipated to have what we would consider average growth rates, or we're just beginning to get to that point. So as we get further out from the effective date of this constitutional amendment, the impacts become that much quicker and get that much larger in a much more rapid succession. As you can see, if you break it out by which component is the most costly, obviously the 5% reduction in the assessment cap is the largest, with a 4-year total of almost $900 million. Next slide. So, and then if you wanted to see the breakdown of by jurisdiction, okay. This is cities, counties, and special districts. One thing I will say on all these numbers, we're still trying to work out the Revenue Estimating Conference last month adopted the new estimates of taxable value. This is actually on the old estimates. They did increase them slightly, but the difference in the impact numbers is really just rounding numbers, or rounding error, I would say. It's not that drastic, but there are numbers that we're working on based off of the most recent Revenue Estimating Conference taxable values. So if you look at counties, over a 4-year total, you're looking at a little over $1 billion. Cities, you're looking at a little less than $500 million in special districts. One point I would make on this, obviously, depending on the makeup of your tax rolls, if you have a larger percentage of non-homestead property in your jurisdiction, maybe higher than the average, then you're going to be disproportionately impacted, given that you are going to have more non-homesteaded properties that are going to have this assessment limitation placed on those properties.
Okay. John Thomas stepped out of the room for a moment. So my name is Jenna Titcomb, and I'm the communications coordinator at the League, and I'm going to fill in here for a moment and talk to you a little bit about messaging. We sent out a toolkit to every mayor in the city of Florida, and basically it was a really in-depth toolkit with a lot of messaging documents and an action plan. There was a sample city resolution, some legal questions answered as far as working with your city attorney, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a couple of the pieces that were sent in that package today. Basically, right here, this paragraph on your screen says, Amendment 4 takes a complicated property tax system and it makes it worse. It shifts Florida's property tax burden onto new and growing businesses and Florida residents while providing special benefits to out-of-state and non-homesteaded property owners. The League took part in some polling, and the following slide are basically the top 5 messages that came out of that polling as the most effective ways to communicate why Amendment 4 is going to impact local governments and, you know, just the general voting public in a negative way. And here's John Thomas to kind of pick it up from here.
Thanks. As she mentioned, the messaging that we've developed is based upon research that we've done almost over a year now. We did a poll a year or so ago, and then we did a poll maybe 6 or 7 months ago, and the messages that we had were rates. It will impact city's major revenue source, which is a big deal, but it is not one of the leading messages, believe it or not, that we lead with. We found in our polling over the last several 3 to 5 years that people don't believe it when you say that you're going to cut revenues and that revenue will have an impact on service delivery by local government. They don't believe that, and quite frankly, in many cases, when there has been sort of a decline in revenue, cities are so inventive in their problem solving that they find a way to make it work, and notwithstanding the lack of revenues. So our lead argument is not that of the loss of the impact of a revenue source, although it's important. Although it is obviously an important factor in service delivery from a political communications perspective. It's not our better and winning argument. the ones that I sort of identified earlier are better and winning arguments. We sent to everyone in every city a toolkit. It was sent directly to the mayor, and it lays out a number of different avenues that we'd like for you to take and to adopt. The first thing is to educate yourself about what the proposed amendment does and does not do. We hope this webinar is a way for you to do that. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions, particularly on the substantive policy side of it. But the most important thing is for you to know what it does, how it impacts your particular city. There may be an opportunity for you to share some of the data and information with your finance staff, if you have them, so that maybe you can provide a little bit more specific details about what it might do to your city. The second thing we ask you to do is to adopt a resolution opposing Amendment 4. That is an option for you to consider. Not every city wants to adopt it. We hope you adopt a resolution, whether to oppose it or to have major concerns about it. You have the legal authority to do that. There is no prohibition of a city taking a position opposing Amendment 4. Number 3, it would be important for you to develop your own action plan to determine what is best and how you can best communicate to your citizens. You always want to speak with your city attorney for them to provide you guidance on what might best fit for your community. But we want you to sort of be out there talking about this, raising this with many of your constituents and your residents. It would also be important to educate your local news media. The way that we sort of have our side of this argument discussed is for it to be in the broader media. So after you've adopted a resolution, we hope, after you've sort of determined what direction you're going to have and what plan you're going to have, we ask that you sort of make outreach to your local news media so that you can shine a light on this issue. One of the things that we are doing, and we will work with you on in Step 5, is the coordination of editorial business and media interviews. We have met with several editorial boards around the state. We'll be happy to meet with others. When we do, we like to have a local city official with us to sort of have the local perspective on this particular issue. And so we ask that if you do want to speak to your editorial board, work with us, we'll be happy to help you to sort of prepare for that, and that also, hopefully, we can also be in attendance as well. Writing opinion editorial pieces or viewpoint pieces or guest columns is another way to communicate, we think, our side of this issue, particularly city officials. If you say you're going to write it, in most cases, your local newspaper will print it. And there's always, they may offer the other perspective on it, which is fine, and may offer, a pro or a con format, but notwithstanding that, it would be very important, again, to have our issues, our perspective, our messages out in front to the readers of those newspapers. Again, media is important in this effort, and your local city access channel, your local public affairs television station, and your city newsletter is an important venue for you to communicate this to. There are some prohibitions, particularly as it relates to your newsletters, that you need to be aware from a legal perspective. And again, before you make any effort to do that, please consult with your city attorney to determine what those particular prohibitions might be. Same thing on step number 8. You still have the opportunity to speak from a very unbiased and a format. There are some specific prohibitions that relates to step 8 and 7, and we suggest that you, again, try to speak with your city attorney before making any efforts in that regard. One of the key things I think is important is that we need as many spokespeople out there on this issue as possible. And so we internally at the Florida League of Cities have developed our own internal speakers bureau, folks who can go out into the community and to organizations and talk about this issue. If you feel so inclined, we suggest that that be a part of your action plan as well, that you'll have 2 or 3 people within your city briefed up, understanding the impacts, can sort of speak fluently about this particular issue, and designate them as people to do so. And the last point on the action plan is, it's important that we share what others are doing. Mayor Manny Moronio, the president of the Florida League of Cities, has put together an Amendment 4 task force, and they're made up of members from around the state of Florida who will help guide and direct our efforts, our strategy efforts, our communications efforts, and serve as spokespeople. And sharing what you do may help others sort of understand the direction they can take in their particular city. We've got from now until November the 6th, which is Election Day, to help us sort of understand how and what everybody is doing and how they can be part of this effort as well. A couple of key final steps. One, that toolkit is a very strong resource, we believe, that you should follow. And if you don't have any, please let us know and contact us, and we'll be sure to get the elements of that toolkit to you. It is designed as a resource. We would hope that you would not copy and make multiple copies for the general public. It's designed as a resource for our city and our city officials' use. But it is fairly clear and direct on how you can be involved in this process. One of the things that the other aspect that I think is important for you to understand as well is that you have the possibility to either oppose or have some concerns as you draft and crafting a resolution for this particular issue. Again, you have legal authority to be opposed to it, but there are some cities who want to take a different stance and want to draw concerns to their citizens about the impact that Amendment 4 might have in their particular jurisdiction. Either one is fine, but you have the authority to do that, and that is the number one key element we think as a start to be involved in the process. We really believe that it would make a great news story if 410 cities crafted and drafted a resolution either drawing concerns about Amendment 4 or are opposed to Amendment 4. That would make a great news story, and our hope is to generate as many of them as possible so that we can sort of create the frame of reference on this issue from our perspective. And then last but not least, it's important to discuss whatever efforts you're going to make that you also, again, consult with your local city attorney for him or her to provide you guidance and direction. And that's it, and I think we're open and ready.
Okay, I'm going to read the first question that we have in, and it says, how do we calculate the specific impact to our city?
I'll take this one. This is Amber Hughes. I will just let you know that it took many economists and staff of the legislature, the Department of Revenue, and many meetings to come up with the statewide impact. I would say that a good starting place would be to get with your finance officer or your budget guys, look at what your current taxable value is, look at the breakdown of non-homesteaded and homesteaded property, maybe look at how many new sales have been made. There are some assumptions that you're going to have to make, and that's why we have not been able to get down on to each city's actual impacts because this amendment is so complicated. I do know that I've heard from a couple of our cities that they have reached out to the property appraisers and have been told that there is not an impact. So that concerns me. I do have breakdown to the county level of the aggregate impact that I'd be happy to send to you, Michael, if you would like to shoot me an email. But I would say that start with the biggest element, which of course is the non-homestead assessment cap, and figure out kind of the breakdown of your taxables there, and maybe go to Recapture. Those are probably the two easiest components to determine. The first-time homesteader additional exemption, you obviously have to make some assumptions, and without knowing, you can figure out how many parcels were sold in your city, and I can send you the assumptions that the REC used in determining how many first-time homesteaders they anticipated to purchase homes. But as I said earlier, I mean, you have to make assumptions. But email me after, and I'll be happy to get you as much information as I can on that.
Okay, we'd love to take some more questions. There's a Q&A section on your monitor. If you'd like to type in a question, we'd be happy to answer it. While we're waiting for a few more questions, I just want to remind you, I know the sound cut out for a brief moment during this presentation, but this webinar will be on the website with full sound. we're going to get it up there as soon as possible after this webinar, so you'll be able to go back through.
In the toolkit you received, you did have a draft or a sample resolution. So that would be a guide for you all to use as you begin to think about how to put this together. There are some specific impact that we know it has, and I direct you to that particular toolkit for direction. Okay, we have another question popped up here, and it says that I saw realtors put $1.5 million into the pro Amendment 4 efforts. What efforts are being made for advertising? That's a great question. We know that this effort is going to be, very difficult for us to overcome. As the questioner mentioned, the Florida Association of Realtors has put up a good amount of money. In fact, 1.5 is to the lower end. It'll probably, at the end of the day, be around $3 to $4 to maybe $5 million, and they've been doing this for about a year. So we know we're up a very difficult opponent. One of the key elements of this, however, is that in order to amend the Constitution, you're going to need 60% of the voters to approve this. So that's a very difficult threshold to overcome or to meet, but it is an important element. We're doing our best to go about things the old-fashioned way. We're going to educate our members. We're going to try to educate the media. That's why your role in this is very important. We're going to do our very level best to be sure that you have all the tools that you need for you to help us to be spokespeople about this particular issue. We're up against a very significant foe, but we feel very confident about our ability to use our best assets, which are you, city officials, to overcome this particular effort. Okay, another question. Can you explain a little more about how the numbers in the chart were developed?
Sure. This is Amber Hughes again. The way that the numbers in the chart were developed, throughout the legislative process, the Florida legislature has what is called the Revenue Estimating Conference, and they have impact conferences to take members of their Office of Economic and Demographic Research, staff from the House Finance and Tax Committee, and staff from the Senate Budget Subcommittee on Finance and Tax, and then staff from the Department of Revenue, and they literally sit in a room and come to a consensus agreement. If you look at any constitutional amendment and you want to look at what the consensus estimated impact is, you will notice that they are all negative indeterminate because it relies on the voter approval, they don't want to put in numbers. That being said, that if you look at the work pages and you look at the footnotes of their consensus estimates, that's where these numbers come from. So we base our estimates off of what the Revenue Estimating Conference did.
Okay, our next question says, will the individual county chapters of the league be contacting the local media directly? For example, will the Miami-Dade League of Cities be contacting the Miami Herald?
We hope so, and our hope is that the number of cities within that particular league region would find this issue big enough that the entire league itself take a position on it. I believe it will require a resolution opposing it, just like it did for the League of Cities to take a position. In 2011, at our annual conference, there was a resolution opposing Amendment 4. And so that will obviously be required. But we've made outreach to all of the local and regional league directors and asked them to be involved and engaged. So we would encourage you to do so. If you've not heard from them, or if you don't know to what extent the local leagues are going to be out front and working on this issue, please contact your league director in your particular area to ask them to do so.
Okay, great. Our next question says, can you provide the calculation FLC used for impacts to counties so that we can try to apply that formula to our city?
Well, once again, those numbers were done by the Revenue Estimating Conference. I can get you the estimates of the county, but the actual formula and the assumptions, a lot of it is conversation. They obviously start with their adopted economic outlook for the state of Florida as a whole. They look at everything from population growth, which they get from beaver, to the estimated tax rolls, and they kind of go from there. But they take all the economic data that they adopt for them looking at their own revenue streams, and that was kind of their starting place. So that's their starting point. That being said, I will try to get you as much information, but so much of it is literally the economists sitting around the table and talking with that as their starting point.
Okay, our next question says, are there legal challenges to the amendments that can be implemented if passed?
I'm not sure if I'm the best person to answer that question. One of our attorneys just left the room. I don't know the answer to the question. Maybe there's something with regard to recapture. I'm not sure, but I think if adopted, we'll take a very strong look at that and see whether there are.
And we'll communicate that to you. Our next question says, are the slides available for printout on the FLC website? And the answer to that is yes. If you have any issues with that, my contact information for Jenna Titcomb, the communications coordinator, is on the screen, and I'd be happy to help you walk through it. So feel free to contact me. Our next question says, what is the impact if this is not passed? What are the proponents' main defense in seeking to change the state constitution?
Okay. Well, the impact if it does not pass would just be current law, meaning that the three elements of that would not, this constitutional amendment would not, this proposed constitutional amendment would not be effective. That being said, there are multiple other constitutional amendments dealing with property taxes, but if this specific amendment doesn't pass, it would just be the way that it's going right now. And what was the second part of the question?
Basically, why are the proponents seeking to change the state constitution?
That's a good question. We contend that the property tax system in Florida is not broken. If you look at the property tax levies from 2004 to 2012 statewide, we are at the 2004 levels. So obviously there was a peak in 2006 and 2007, but property tax levies are below the levels that they were in 2004. So we contend that there really is not a broken property tax system with regard to property taxes being too high. It obviously this proposal continues to exacerbate a system that's convoluted and that makes identical properties pay different property tax levels. So in that sense, there is a problem. But in terms of property taxes being too high, there's no evidence to show that.
The next question we have is, does FLC have opinions on the other constitutional amendments that aim to limit local government revenues?
No, this is the only one on the ballot this year that the Florida League of Citizens is taking a position against.
Following question, if there is inflation that shoots well over 5%, as many predict, then what?
Well, if the inflation impacts the market value, then that would just exacerbate the system, and that just shows why you have assessment limitations. Why assessment limitations are not always good tax policy. The higher our growth rate is over the 5%, and you have to understand that you can't just take 5% as a whole, because obviously when you have a 3% assessment limitation on one group of properties, and then you have, if this passes, a 5% assessment cap on another group, the other group of properties, obviously the average is somewhere in between the two. So if the growth rate of Florida gets above that, or the growth rate in your specific area gets above that, then obviously any of that additional growth would not be reflected in the taxable value for a specific city or county. I think that Amendment 10, or when Amendment 10 put the 10% assessment cap in place, I think that's the perfect example to look at. Obviously, going into 2008, there were multiple properties that were non-homesteaded that had growth above the 10%, but since the passage of the 10% assessment limitation, very small percentage of the parcels have actually been given the benefit because they had not had growth over that 10%, and the majority of those were vacant land. But being said, if we have fantastic growth, which I know we all hope to have, and our state gets back into gear, then obviously the taxing entities are going to have taxable levels that are stuck down at the bottom.
Okay, I've seen a couple comments come in, and I've got one more question on the list to ask, but feel free to submit another if you've got one on your mind. Do your numbers include a cumulative effect over the 4-year period?
No. Well, I mean, the proposal itself is cumulative, but it's each year is taken individually. The only cumulative number is the total, 4-year total. So each year is individual and then obviously added up. The impact of the amendment is obviously cumulative because if you put a cap on your assessed value and you can only go up 5% every year, that is a cumulative effect in its own, but it's not reflected in the numbers, which are done by fiscal year.
One of the comments that came through that we definitely agree with here at the League says, education needs to get out there now. Early voting and absentee ballots will be cast prior to November 6th. So we absolutely agree with that. This is, we're kind of zeroing in on the time where we really need to have all boots on the ground and we need to be talking to people. So thank you, Dorothy. We couldn't agree more. We are waiting on any other questions. We definitely have a few more minutes to talk through some questions. So no question is dumb. Okay. It is standard practice in the state of Florida to use the state constitution to implement, change, alter, or tweak the tax code.
This is Amber. I'll take that question. Ad valorem taxes, or property taxes as we like to call them, are the only source of revenue that local governments have. It's how we have decided historically in our state the only source of revenue that we have that's given to us by the people of Florida in the Constitution. In the history of the state, we have decided that that was how we were going to fund local government. That being said, the only way that you can modify the property tax system in Florida is by amending the Constitution because we have held it up to such a gold standard, I would say. Other revenue sources, which are just given to us by the legislature, can be modified in the statutes. And I think that's why, from my perspective as the finance and tax lobbyist for the League, I'm especially protective over this revenue stream. But unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, that is why it is in the Constitution. Any other questions?
One last point before we close out. I guess we have a few more minutes left. I'd like to go over some of the really key facts about and key messages we have because it is very important as you communicate and talk to people about it that you understand it and you understand sort of what the impact of this might be. One, it does hurt new jobs and growing businesses. It puts new and growing businesses at a disadvantage. So it's very clear, it's very key that that's communicated. It makes our complicated property tax system even worse. This adds another homestead exemption in addition to the 2008 Amendment 1 changes to the property tax system we've had, and there are a slew of them going back to the early 80s and the mid 90s. We've just played around with this system so much that I think this will continue to complicate it, and citizens won't know how their property taxes are calculated and sort of what their property tax requirements and burdens are. It is unfair to homesteaders. This is not relief property taxes. It gives some people a break and somebody else has to pay for it. It's clear that that's the case. This does not relieve property taxes. It just makes somebody else pay for the relief that some level of taxpayer and property owner does. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it makes identical properties pay very different property taxes. It's just not fair that a business who's in the same business at the same level of square foot in the same area will pay very different property taxes than another business. Identical property taxes, we think in a fair system would pay just or about the same level of taxation. And then the last thing, and not least obviously, is the fact that it does impact a major revenue source for our local governments and our cities particularly. This is, I think Amber mentioned, over a 5 or 4 year period, it's about a $1.6 billion impact. That's real money, folks. Local governments, cities, and city officials will be put into and possibly be put into the position of having to either raise taxes or cut services. Nobody likes those alternatives. That's why we need to defeat this, and we need your help in order to do that.
Okay, we had a few more questions come in here. Can you speak about state restrictions on advocating a position on a referendum issue?
There are no. The only restrictions are, one, you can take, your city can take a they can take a position in opposition to a state referendum issue. A city official can have a position. They can have a position either for or against a proposed constitutional amendment. The law is very clear. The toolkit that we sent you has a legal do's and don'ts section that has been vetted and directed by two of Florida's, we believe, eminent elections and ethics attorneys. It is very clear. You, as a city official or a city official, can take a position in opposition to this. You can write an article. You can go on TV. You can talk about it in public forums. You have every right to do so according to law. Again, if you have any particular questions, we recommend that you ask your city attorney first before you do such things. But our law is very clear, and we've got some opinions written by the Division of Elections to demonstrate that. So again, feel free to call us if you have any questions.
Another question says, it appears that the 5-year phase, and that if we lose $100,000 the first year, assuming we lose $100,000 the second year, that we should also add $80,000 for the first year's loss. Is that correct?
I'm not sure I know what they're referring to. If they're talking about the first-time homesteader exemption, you would take what the total first-time homesteader exemption would be. So in my Neon County example, my $300,000 house, I would get an exemption that was $150,000, and that would reduce by 20% every year for 5 years. Well, for 4 more years. So I'm not sure about their math there. I can't see that far.
Okay, if you want to email Amber directly, I'm sure she can walk you through that example that you gave us on the screen. Another question says, is it true that with all these amendments, if passed, to fully be effective, the legislature must pass implementing laws?
I'll take that question. Amber Hughes. With quite a few of these constitutional amendments, including Amendment 4, they passed implementing bills along with the joint resolution. So they went simultaneously through the legislative process either in the 2011 session or the 2012 session. With Amendment 4, they implemented the first 2 elements that we talk about, so the first-time homesteader and the 5% non-homestead assessment cap. The one piece of this that they would have to go back in and pass a law about is the recapture portion. And if you have a question on any of the other amendments, you can email me about whether or not they passed implementing language.
Can league staff be available to make presentations to municipal councils during a regularly scheduled meeting, typically at night or via web conference?
Yes. We have responded already to a number of those, and we'll be happy to do that to as many as we can. We've got a number of people, as I mentioned, that have been designated as sort of spokespeople for that, and we're available for your information.
Okay, that looks like all the questions we have so far. I'll remind you that, we have one question that just came in. Who are the biggest proponents of this?
The biggest proponents is the Florida Association of Realtors. They've been the ones that proposed this. They offered it to a number of the leadership people in the House in 2011 in the 2011 legislature, and they're the ones behind the don't have your assets taxed off. You don't have your assets taxed off commercials and radio ads and mail pieces that you've seen.
Okay, if you do have any other questions, please feel free to contact us directly. Our contact information is on the screen. And this will conclude today's webinar. The League of Cities would like to thank you for your participation and We hope that you have enough information now to go back and be advocates to your citizens, and of course, we're available to you. And again, this presentation will be on the website, and if you have any difficulty downloading the slides, please feel free to contact us. Thank you.